Up next, from a Washington Center forum on American foreign policy, a look at intelligence and foreign policy in a speech by William Colby, former director of the Central Intelligence Agency.
Welcome to the Washington Center and the seminar on American foreign policy, crisis and choices. Our speaker today is very well known and probably doesn't need an introduction, but for those of you who don't remember his tenure and all, I would like to give an introduction. It's very impressive. Mr. Colby held the position of Chief of the CIA's Far Eastern Division from 1963 to 1968. He was Executive Director and Comptroller of the Central Intelligence Agency from 1972 to 73, and he was Director of the CIA from 1973 to 1976. Since that time, he has been a consultant on international and domestic political matters to various corporations, governments, and investment organizations. He's been a partner with Reed & Priest, a prominent New York law firm engaged in international law and other matters, and in January 1985, Mr. Colby became a member of the international consulting firm of Colby, Bailey & Associates. In earlier positions, he served with the American embassies in Stockholm, in Rome, and in Saigon, and as ambassador and deputy to the commander of the U.S. Military Assistance Command in Vietnam from 68 to 71. In that position, he directed the American support to the Vietnamese government's rural pacification program. He started his career as an attorney with an LLB from the Columbia Law School. He's received numerous high awards and distinctions during his career, including the National Security Medal in 1976, the Distinguished Intelligence Medal in 73, and the State Department's Distinguished Honor Award in 1972. He's also a decorated World War II veteran. He received the Silver and the Bronze Stars, the French Croix de Guerre, and the Norwegian St. Olaf's Medal, among other honors. He's widely published here and abroad, and I hope you'll join with me in welcoming Mr. Colby today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure, and I apologize that all my intelligence experience didn't enable me to find a parking space until now. I think your studies here in Washington are all very complicated and deep and serious, and therefore your sponsors here wanted to give you a little bit of a break. So they thought they would introduce you to a real live spy. And already I think some of you are a little disappointed. He doesn't look much like a spy, you know, glasses, and gray hair. I mean, where's the cloak? Where's the stiletto? Where's the blonde? Isn't that what we get when we get a spy? That's the tradition of intelligence ever since Moses sent the first spy into Canaan, and they came back with our first economic intelligence report, which is a little dubious when they said that the land was flowing with milk and honey. I guess Joshua did as much for the profession as anyone. He sent 2 spies into Jericho, and they spent the night at the home of Rahab the harlot. And based on their careful investigations of the situation in Jericho from that particular vantage point, they came back and told Jericho that the people there were faint-hearted. So he decided he didn't have to attack the city. He marched around it, blew the trumpets, gave a great shout, and sure enough, the walls fell down. Now that is the tradition of intelligence. The spy who sneaks in secretly, gets the secret, brings it back so that the general can win the battle. Now, granted, I don't look like a spy. I've been a spy. I've jumped out of airplanes at midnight over enemy country. I've gone up the back streets of Central Europe and made secret meetings in little out-of-the-way apartments. I've gone through the jungles of Southeast Asia on paramilitary operations. So, all right, maybe he is a spy, but he still doesn't look like it. Now, why is that? I'll tell you why it is. It's because intelligence is different than that old image of the spy. And indeed, modern intelligence is a total change. There are still spies, yes, but the whole of intelligence is a much bigger thing, a much more important thing than the old spy business used to be. Now, there have been 4 major revolutions in intelligence, and most of them have occurred in the last 40-odd years here in this country. it started with Pearl Harbor and our investigations as to why we had been misled and were not alerted to that attack. We found that it wasn't for lack of information. There was information lying all over the American government, but it wasn't drawn together. Some in the State Department, some in the Navy, some in the Army, various places, but no central place. So when we looked at that and had that experience, President Roosevelt turned to an old friend, William Donovan from New York, and asked him to set up a wartime intelligence agency. Now, he turned to him for two reasons. First, he was a very heroic fellow, so he'd be an appropriate chief of people who would jump out of airplanes over an enemy country. He had won the Medal of Honor in World War I, and he'd been very prominent in New York affairs in the period after that. But he also was another facet to him, and that was a thinker, a student. He enjoyed wandering around the world, finding out what was happening, reading voluminously, looking at all the information he possibly could, and then digesting it. And when he set up the nation's intelligence service, he did set up the spy part of it. And he had the people who went in on intelligence missions or guerrilla operations and that sort of thing, like myself. But he also had another part to the agency, which was the Center of Analysis. He brought here to Washington professors, experts from various parts of the world, and sat them here in Washington and fed all the material to them, and then asked them to make judgments about what it means, what that really does signify, all that information, cross-checking it, finding the contradictions in the information, trying to figure out what they all really mean. Now, that was the origin of the first revolution in intelligence, the center of analysis, in addition to the accumulation of information. And that did change the nature of intelligence. That's why we call it now the Central Intelligence Agency. It's central. It's a central center to which all the information comes and then can be analyzed and thought about. And then final estimates and reports can be written based on all the sources available, the open material just as much as the secret material. And in these modern days, a great deal of our information is, of course, open. Glasnost has opened a great deal about the Soviet Union that we really never had before. So that is part of the function, then, of intelligence, and it's the first revolution. Now, the second revolution in intelligence occurred during the 1950s, when we discovered that getting spies into Stalin's Russia was a lot harder than people had thought, that he had the place hermetically sealed, he had the KGB police and so forth, and he had the people under total control. And we didn't have access to the information we absolutely needed to know about the Soviet armed forces, for instance, and Soviet power. How were we to find it out? The spies were caught. The aircraft were shot down. How were we to find out? Somebody had the bright idea of turning to America's technological experts to help us out. And we reached out and got a hold of one of America's foremost aerodynamics engineers. And we put him together with some physicists in photo optics and some chemists in the sensitive chemistry of film systems. And that team built a new plane, a plane that flew further and higher than anyone had to date. And that plane was then equipped with cameras and sensitive film. And the plane flew over the center of the Soviet Union from about 1958 on. And it brought home pictures of things we had suspected might be there, but we had no real hope of ever finding them out. Now, in 1960, that plane was shot down. Khrushchev developed a missile that got up high enough to knock it out of the sky. And we had a little embarrassment because the pilot was captured and the aircraft went on exhibition. And Khrushchev got annoyed that we were flying over his country. But just about that time, a whole new dimension of technology opened up to us, the satellite world. And we began to send up the satellites with the cameras and the film. And those have been improved over the last years, so that today we can look at things, identify things with clarity that we never could have seen before. We don't ask a spy to slink out of Hong Kong and work his way up through China with great danger and difficulty, and then try to tell us what's happening on the Manchurian border with the Soviet Union. Because we don't have to. We look down on it. We count the planes, we count the tanks, we count the units, the troop units. We see them move from time to time with a scope of information and a precision of information that no spy could have ever given us with any degree of reliability. And immediacy, too. We get it right away and not years later. Now, this has been a real revolution in intelligence. We now know things that previously we only guessed about. We can measure things, count things, and this has changed the nature of our intelligence system. Now, there's some things that the cameras or the electronics or the computers or the acoustics under the earth or the kind of sensitive systems we have working in the undersea to identify where submarines are throughout the North Atlantic. These kinds of systems can tell you where something is, in great part. But can they tell you what's going to happen, what people are thinking of? No. There you have to try to deduce it from their public statements, from their statements to their fellows that you managed to pick up and pass through a spy, or through sometimes just making a logical guess. Now, the nature of intelligence is like a jigsaw. And you've all played with a jigsaw. And you know that long before you put the last piece in the jigsaw, you can see the essential picture there. Now, every piece is helpful in building up that picture. But you can get the picture, you can estimate the picture, even if you don't have all the pieces. And that's the nature of intelligence. You pick up the little pieces, try to arrange them in the right way so that you then begin to see the larger picture that you don't know. Now, the technological revolution then added immeasurably to the amount of information that we have to work with to give us the basis for that kind of judgment about what's going to happen. Now, here in America, we made a third major revolution in intelligence. In the tradition of intelligence, the little spy service, and it's a small one, reported to the king or the prime minister or the president, and nobody else. And it was totally secret, off to the side in the government. And it was just something that everybody realized it might be there, but nobody asked questions. When I went into the OSS during World War II, and people asked you where you worked, you answered, for the government. And everybody knew that that was a signal that you were in intelligence, and you wouldn't tell them where you worked. And at that time, as distinct from today, people would just turn off and go to another subject and have another topic. Today, they will probe in and ask where in the government and all the rest of it in a rather nosy way. But in America, we adopted that same technique at first. We thought that the intelligence service should work for the president, and it wasn't anybody else's business. It wasn't the Congress's business. A few of the major leaders of Congress were generally informed as to what the intelligence business was all about, but they didn't hold hearings. They didn't ask questions. They just sent the money over and let us spend it for intelligence. And everybody thought that was the way it should be. Now, the problem is there was a growing contradiction between that myth of the old system of intelligence and the reality of modern intelligence. And perhaps it's best explained by saying that in 1960, Allen Dulles, our then director of intelligence, had the idea of bringing all these people together and putting them in a single building so that they could talk to each other. All the spy masters and the spies and the analysts and the scientists and all those people, put them all together so they can communicate. So he went up the Potomac about 5 miles out here, and he built himself a nice building with the congressional approval. They just handed him the money. He built the building, and it turned out to be a fairly big building. So when they finished it, they put a sign on the parkway, CIA, and thought that was quite normal. Well, there was a fellow living in the neighborhood who had quite a lot of influence. His name was Bobby Kennedy, and he was going to be the Attorney General, and he became, by the time they inaugurated the building, it belonged to to John Kennedy's administration. And Bobby Kennedy lived nearby, and he drove by this sign one day. And he said, came in, and he said, you know, this is the silliest thing I've ever seen. Here's a secret intelligence agency on a 4-lane parkway with a great big sign pointing to it. For God's sake, at least take the sign down. And we took the sign down. He did have quite a lot of influence. And for 15 years, we pretended that that big building wasn't there. Even though every pilot on his way out of National Airport used it as a checkpoint, turn left at CIA, because it was so obvious. Now, here was something where we were trying to live by the myth when it really couldn't work anymore. And there was a contradiction between the reality and that myth. Now, there was also a contradiction growing up as intelligence became more important to our country, because we have a Constitution which says that we divide our powers between the executive, the Congress, and the judiciary. And we don't give anything just to one. Each one has its role in governing our country and in running our government. And here, intelligence seemed to be an exception. So this was a contradiction. Well, sooner or later, that contradiction had to be resolved, just as the one of the size of the building had to be resolved. And this happened in the usual American way, with a lot of histrionics and sensationalism and arm-waving and TV cameras in the mid-'70s. And we conducted a great investigation into the 25-year history of CIA at that point as to what it had done, what it should have done, what it shouldn't have done. And in that course of that, it brought out a number of things that in CIA we had discovered, I frankly had discovered a couple of years before, had corrected, and had sort of sunk and said, let's forget it because they'll be exaggerated and sensationalized. But I did report it to the 2 committees of the Congress. But that didn't stop it. We were in the post-Vietnam, post-Watergate enthusiasm for attacking the authority and the government and so forth. And so we had a great year of investigations. And as a result, we developed the concept that the Congress did need to play a role in the supervision of intelligence. The report of the special committee that looked into the intelligence during that year said that it wasn't that CIA was out of control. In fact, if anything, it had been too much under the control of presidents. It wasn't a rogue elephant, in other words, as the phrase was then. What it was that Congress had not done its constitutional job of supervising the agency. Now, how can the whole Congress supervise an agency? It really can't. And therefore, you have to figure out some compromise system by which that will work. And so in each House, there is now a special committee to govern intelligence, one in the Senate, one in the House. And these members are selected by the leadership of the body. The executive has no role in who they should be, and they are given a charter to know the secrets and told to keep the secrets. And by and large, they do. The congressman, it's favorite game to blame the Congress for all leaks here in town, but a congressman, I think, said it rather well. He said he didn't think Congress leaked any more than the executive, which really isn't saying much, quite frankly. But it's a fact that you do have an additional exposure. But what else you get out of it is the application of our constitutional controls over the activities of our CIA. Now, we had a little adventure the last year or two, the Iran-Contra, where the administration was trying to run around those controls and not abide by them. And the thing turned out to be a 3-ply disaster, and some people are going to be convicted of crimes for being involved in it. And it's just another illustration that that's the wrong way to run anything in our country, that you've got to follow the constitutional norms and recognize the role of the Congress, the role of the judiciary, as well as the role of the executive. Now, that's a major revolution in intelligence. A few other countries have followed the example to a limited degree, setting up committees of their parliaments or legislatures. Most of them have not, and still pretend it's the good old days. For instance, Britain, where the name of the head of the intelligence service is still a state secret. He doesn't appear at Washington Center meetings or on the television or on C-SPAN or whatever. He is a secret, unquote, even though half of London knows who he is, but it's still a secret. So that third lesson in the third revolution has not gone everywhere. I noticed with some amusement that the new Supreme Soviet is talking about setting up a committee which will supervise the KGB. Now, if you ask for perestroika, a change in the Soviet system, that's about as big a change as I think you'll ever see, when the elected Congress has a right to supervise the activities of the intelligence service of the Soviet Union. Now, out of these three revolutions has come a fourth, which I think in a way is the most important of all. And that is, what is the role, what is the purpose of intelligence? As I said, it used to be that you stole the secret, gave it to the general, and he won the battle. But today the purpose of intelligence is much greater than that, much more important than that. It's to create understanding in our government of the complicated problems that exist around the world, of what threats exist, how big they are, how small they are, what kind of threats are they, where do they come from, what kinds of actions could be taken to ameliorate them. Now, one of the major contributions, for instance, has been in the area of arms control, because for years we were unable to make arms control agreements with the Soviet Union because we couldn't be confident that they would abide by them, and we wouldn't know whether they did or not. But in 1972 we made an agreement with the Soviets not to have anti-ballistic missile systems in our two nations. There's a small exception. There's one limited area where you can have it in each country, but not to have a nationwide anti-ballistic missile system. And that was a conscious decision that we both took. We faced an arms race in these systems which would have left us both poorer and probably exposed us to more danger rather than less. And therefore we made that agreement. But we knew that we would be able to tell whether the Soviets abided by that agreement or not. And in fact, we have watched very carefully. And in fact, we are absolutely sure that there is no nationwide ABM system in the Soviet Union. Now, a few years ago, we found them building a rather big construction site in Siberia. And we watched it. We found it about a year after they began to build it. And we watched it, and it looked very suspiciously like a phased array radar, which is a portion of an ABM system. Now, the treaty said that you can build that kind of a system on the border of your country, facing out. But you can't have one in the interior of your country, because then you could use it to manage an ABM system. And if it's on facing out, it can't be used for that over your own country. But we looked at it, and it was in the wrong place. It was 1,000 miles inside the Soviet Union, in the middle of Siberia. And we called, after a year or so, we called the Soviets on it. We said, come on now, you're not allowed to build that. That's in the wrong place. And they said, oh, no, this is just a space tracking system. It really doesn't have hidden for that. We said, baloney, I don't care what you call it. It's quite obviously going to have the capabilities of being an ABM radar. Well, no. And we finally, this became a major issue between us, because here was what we called a violation of the treaty by the Soviets. And in fact, it was. Well, we finally dragged down on it. And finally, the Soviets kind of gave up, and they said, "Oh, yeah, I guess it's not in the right place." And they invited 3 of our congressmen to go through it, just like this visit the other day in the Space Center in the Soviet Union. And these 3 congressmen went through this particular radar system, and they found that the cement construction hadn't even been finished. The electronics weren't anywhere in sight. They would take another 3 or 4 years. Now, this visit took place about 4 years after the beginning of the construction, about 3 years after we discovered it. You could compute that it would take them another 3 to 5 years to finish that system. Then you have to say, and it wouldn't be of any good if it weren't surrounded by ABM batteries that it could manage, which would take another 5 years to produce. So here we have a violation of the treaty, which our intelligence caught within a year of the construction beginning, year or so, a year and a half, something like that. And we then saw it. It was at least 9 or 10 years away from being a threat to the United States when we first found it. And during that time, we have negotiated with the Soviets. They have now stopped construction on it. They have offered to tear it down if we will do something on our side that they say is also a violation. We say it isn't. We're a little bit of an impasse there, but meanwhile the construction is stopped. Now, people say, well, here was a violation. That's right. And we caught it. And we stopped it. Now, that's the function of intelligence these days, to provide the knowledge, the confidence as to what's going on someplace, to allow you to negotiate, to reduce the threats to your country, rather than build up arms to replace them. Now, under Mr. Gorbachev recently, he's opened up a great deal of information about their military, and we previously did not know. But more and more what we learn, we already knew, because we knew the size of the units, the numbers of tanks, and all the rest. But this kind of intelligence today allows us to negotiate, allows us to make treaties, to solve problems, rather than to have them fester and explode into violence. And I think that's the real purpose of intelligence, to understand the Islamic fundamentalists. And understand doesn't mean sympathize. To understand where they're coming from, why they are that way, because then you can maybe figure out a way to negotiate with them. Whereas if you just see them screaming in the streets, you really sort of give up on the idea of negotiating. There are various other ways in which intelligence can help you. Aside from the understanding, aside from the old facts of how big are the enemy forces there, what kind of assistance goes to Nicaragua from Cuba, from the Soviet Union to Cuba, you can even begin to negotiate on some of those problems. We have seen a withdrawal of the Soviets from Afghanistan. We can watch that and see it. We have seen a negotiated solution in Angola, which we hadn't believed. Intelligence has made its contribution to all of these. So the function of intelligence today, then, is this understanding and this development of greater confidence, not necessarily trust, just confidence that you know what may come in the future. Now, there is another part of intelligence which we call action, covert action, and that is secret activity in some other country aimed to produce a political or even paramilitary result there. And this is what most of the publicity runs around and most of the arm waving is about. And people look back on various mistakes and failures that we had in the past. The Bay of Pigs is the most famous one, when we supported a group of Cubans to land on the beach of Cuba to try to liberate that country from Castro in 1961. And it failed. And it was generally considered a terrible thing to have gotten involved in. But on the other hand, if you think a little bit about what happened about 14 months later, 15 months later, in October 1962, when Khrushchev put nuclear missiles in Cuba secretly, with the idea of unveiling them someday and having it clear that they threatened the entire United States, except a few miles of forest up in northwest Washington. And I don't mean D.C., I mean the other one. And to create a shock effect and to secure an enormous threat to the United States. Now, we discovered that at the last minute, just barely. Our intelligence identified it. We took pictures of it. We knew about it. And President Kennedy was prepared to go in and take those out, if necessary, before they came into operational readiness. Our intelligence was able to tell him, by the way the pictures looked, that he had about 10 days to 2 weeks before they would be in firing status. And he had that time to negotiate, or if necessary, to send the troops in to take them out. And he did both, got ready to send the troops, but negotiated. And at the last minute, Khrushchev blinked and removed them. Now, that was the nearest time we've ever gotten to nuclear war. But let's face it, if the Bay of Pigs had succeeded a year and a half earlier, that would not have occurred. That potential would not have occurred. And a few Cubans could have liberated Cuba and preserved our country from that kind of threat. Now, I won't say that all these operations were either justifiable or smart, or certainly successful. But in a number of cases, they have been very successful and very effective. We had successful activities in Laos. We had successful activities in Western Europe in the period after the World War II, when the Soviets were trying to take it over by political subversion, and we supported the democratic parties and democratic groups to face them. And most recently, I saw a statement by Judge Webster, who is the present head of CIA, that CIA had devoted the large number of less than 100 people to support the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Now, 100 Americans managed to create the first time the Soviet Union has been defeated in the recent years. It's quite a step. 100 Americans, not 500,000 soldiers marching around with their guns and planes and tanks, but 100 CIA people funneling assistance and support to the Mujahideen, the rebels against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. Now, I think that is the kind of action that can take place through covert action. It doesn't need to be covert, then it shouldn't be covert. We now do things in public through independent organizations that we formally set up and even ran as covert operations at one time. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty receive open appropriations from the Congress every year. They're run by an independent board appointed by our government, but they are an independent board. That's the way they run. Now, they were started by CIA, and we pretended that they were funded by private contributions, because at that time it was felt that a government could not be associated with saying the things that the Radio Free Europe and the Radio Liberty might be saying. Since that time, we've become more sophisticated. The Soviets have become more sophisticated. They don't even jam Radio Liberty anymore. That's a step in the right direction. But the fact is that there are some things that do have to be secret. There are reasons sometimes for the secrecy. Those people who helped in Nicaragua helped through a certain country. That country doesn't want to be officially admitted as helping, and therefore everybody discreetly doesn't mention which country is doing the helping. And yet everybody knows it, of course, but it's just a polite way of not embarrassing the people who are helping us. And that's why we have to run it as what we now call rather an overt-covert operation, which is a little contradiction in terms. But those kinds of operations will be around. They've been around since the United States first started its war for independence from the British, and they will be around for a long time to come. They need to be controlled by our government and by our Congress, and they are. But these are the changes that have occurred in intelligence over these years. Intelligence now plays a central role in the formulation of policy. When the National Security Council meets, the Director of Central Intelligence opens the meeting with a briefing on what they're talking about. What is the situation in country X, and what does it look like is going to happen there? After he speaks, the National Security Advisor to the President then says, now, Mr. President, here are the options your staffs and the departments have figured out for you to do about this situation. Some are military, some are economic, some are diplomatic, various kinds. And then there's a discussion by the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the other people there. But the intelligence is the base for the discussion. And that is the role of intelligence today in the American government. Thank you very much. Be glad to take your questions, and remember, there are no indiscreet questions, there are only indiscreet answers. Yes, sir.
Identify yourself and your school.
What is the current policy towards the People's Republic of China? Is it still wait and see? And what's the possibility of policy change, if any, if the purges still continue?
Right. Well, the situation is that the United States has reacted in the sense that it has condemned the repression of the students and workers in Tiananmen and in the other areas of China. It has suspended military sales. It has suspended certain credits that were going to China as a result. We have not broken off relations, and I don't think we will. We want to maintain relations in the hope that the Chinese government will gradually release the repression that it's placed on its people. Unfortunately, the Chinese government doesn't seem to be giving many signs of doing that, and you saw in this morning's papers and yesterday's papers the new idea they have that before people go to college, they spend a year in the Army to make sure they're properly indoctrinated. Or before they go to graduate school, they spend a couple of years in a commune out in the countryside, helping feed the pigs and so forth, in order to make sure that they've got the right proletarian spirit. Now, that's a reversion to the Cultural Revolution days. It bespeaks the fact that the old men running China today are getting very crotchety about these uppish young students demanding more and more freedom and liberty. The Chinese tried to open up the economic system without changing the political system. You can't do it. And they had the lesson that the students did rise into protest. The students really didn't know what they wanted. They wanted more democracy, but they really didn't have an idea of what it was. And the old men, instead of handling them in a sensible way that older men should handle young people, of reaching out to them and helping them articulate specifically what they needed and what they wanted and satisfying them in that sense, the old men just lectured to them and told them to go back and mind their own business and leave the running of the government to them. And they have repressed them to date. They won't stay repressed forever. They'll bubble up again. The history of China over the centuries is the alternation between the centralization of power and the gradual decentralization until eventually you get a form of anarchy. And then you get another centralization surge. Now, that used to take centuries. Today it takes decades, but the process will resume. What will the United States do? The United States does not want to totally cut off relations with the government. We have relations with a whole bunch of governments that we don't approve of because we need to have contact with them. But certainly the foreign tourists won't be going there. The foreign investors won't be going there. And the Chinese government is going to take a loss on this whole affair. And when it begins to realize the size of the loss, then it'll start to change. The Cultural Revolution was supposed to be a great new thing. And what it basically did was almost eliminate a generation of university students from that country. Now, this time, the Chinese have something like 40,000 students in the United States. Are they going to lose those talented young people for the future of China? There's a very good chance they will, because very few of those will go home. And they will begin to see the cost of this kind of behavior, and then somebody will come along and say, let's take another look. Let's wait until Mr. Deng Xiaoping goes on to his just or unjust reward, and then I think you will have a little struggle as to whether to modify the hard line. But the United States position will be one of disapproval, but not of leading any major campaign against China. We've got to maintain some connections with them because we have to keep them as a part of the world political balance. Yes, sir.
In your book, Honorable Men, you mentioned after the Tet Offensive and after the Phoenix program was over, how you rode around a motorcycle near the ancient city of Hue and how essentially the Viet Cong were wiped out. Do you think with the cutoff of funds in '74, if they had actually been, the funds had kept coming, do you think the Republic of South Vietnam would exist today, essentially?
I do, and I'm putting out a book in the fall on the Vietnam experience, the whole thing. I think that the fall of Vietnam was not preordained. I'm not saying it would have succeeded, but I really come down to the fact that I think it would have had about an even chance. The South Vietnamese fought off a North Vietnamese attack in 1972, fought it off with their own troops and their own effort and their own blood. The United States had removed over 500,000 soldiers from Vietnam before that attack took place. Now, the Americans provided two things to meet that attack. They provided logistics, lots of it, and they provided air power from our bombers, from the carriers and the B-52s. And those bombers were very effective against the North Vietnamese military units and helped the South Vietnamese fight them off. Now, in 1975, the North Vietnamese attacked at almost the same three places, with again a pure military attack. There were no more guerrillas in the country, not because they'd been shot, but because they'd been recruited. And many of the people who had been on the other side were on the government side by 1972 and 1975. The North Vietnamese admit that they had no support from guerrillas. It was a pure military assault. But this time, the North Vietnamese said that President Thieu of South Vietnam had to fight what they called a poor man's war because of the restrictions on American military assistance. And of course, there were no bombers to support the South Vietnamese, and the South Vietnamese army collapsed, and South Vietnam has fallen. Now, I call it a lost victory because I think there was a victory in 1972 at the end of a long, agonizing period during which we made a lot of mistakes. But nonetheless, we had victory in that I could, as the gentleman said, ride on a motorcycle with a friend from one side of the delta of Vietnam to the other on Tet 1971, 3 years after Tet 68. And if we had tried that in 68, we would have been killed within 5 miles of our departure. We had changed the situation, not by shooting the enemy, but by turning to the people of South Vietnam, giving them the means to defend themselves. We distributed over 500,000 weapons to the villages of Vietnam, not to the police or military, they had their own, but to the villages. And in the village, the young people of the community would stand guard 1 or 2 nights a week, unpaid, and they were required to do it by their community. But they stood guard. They weren't very good soldiers, but they were a guard. And the enemy did not have the free access to the community that he did before. And that changed the nature of the countryside of Vietnam. So my answer to the question is yes. I think the really agonizing problem is that the North Vietnamese won the war, but they have lost a victory also because of the disaster that they've brought upon South Vietnam. The economy is a shambles. They've been invading Cambodia. They're total failure of government, and they've had a total failure. Meanwhile, the neighboring countries of Thailand, Taiwan, Korea have become spectacular success stories in the growth of those countries in these last years. And the Vietnamese, as we are seeing in our schools today, are every bit as smart, every bit as energetic as the Koreans and the Taiwanese and the Thai. And they would be another, quote, tiger of East Asia if they were still independent. Yes, sir.
So you Thompson from Indiana University of Pennsylvania. I was wondering what you might suggest to counteract our lack of success in intelligence gathering techniques in predicting the action of the Chinese government recently, and our lack of success in being able to get information out of the Mideast, the terrorists.
Well, those are two different things. I think the Chinese situation, the intelligence of that, there weren't any secrets to learn. That was an unfolding development, which has its own dynamic and begins to move. And you can make estimates about where it's going to go, but I think the individual day's events you're not going to be able to predict very well. Curiously, in intelligence, sometimes it's easier to predict a year ahead than it is to predict a week ahead, because the variables make a lot of difference in a week, whereas the fundamentals are more important for a year. I think we have known for a long time that the Chinese economy has successfully opened, and that has put pressures on the situation and on the political system. That the apparatus, the Communist Party apparatus, has become increasingly restive at seeing all this power flow out of their hands and not be able to control it to the degree they should. They wanted to, rather. The role of the students was not as predictable, although students have played that role in China on many previous occasions. So the possibility of, I think it was generally thought that China would have to change, would have to open up, that the economy was forcing the political system open. Now, what happened was that they went a little too far, and the old men repressed them. But that fundamental development is still underway, and the students will be back, even if they have to go out to the country for a little bit. They'll still be back, pressing for a greater opening. Unless the regime tries to control the economy again, in which case they'll break it, and it won't work. But I think there's not too much to criticize about the estimates in China. I don't think you can write a scenario for a country. I can't write a scenario today for what's going to happen to Mr. Gorbachev. I can identify that there are lots of strains there, but how it's going to balance out, I really can't make much of a prediction with any surety. The Middle East is a different subject. There you have terrorist gangs. They are tough to penetrate. They are ideologues. They are fanatics. They are small, generally. They operate in secrecy, in great secrecy, with very strong discipline over each other. Now, you're not going to let ask a James Bond to go in and find out where our hostages are. He isn't going to get off the dime. What you have to do is find somebody in that society who is sufficiently unhappy with its abuses, with whatever, that he will talk to you. Now, how does he make contact? How do you make contact with him? How do you maintain communication? It's a very tough subject, very tough. It's not something that you do in a short time. You have to build it up over the years. You have to build up the intermediaries, because you won't have a direct meeting between a fellow like that and an American CIA officer. You'll have to go through half a dozen intermediaries. Now, that takes time. By the time you go through the intermediaries, the hostage has been moved. We ran a raid on a POW camp in North Vietnam, and we found that the prisoners had been moved shortly before. These are the problems of this kind of intelligence. You can still do some. We did manage to get one of the people we were interested in to take a trip over to Cyprus and to go out for a day of boating. And the boat just happened to go out of Cyprus territorial waters. And there was a great big American carrier looking right at it. And they picked this gentleman up and put him in the brig and brought him back to the United States and put him in jail. Now, that was a pretty good operation. Nobody's laws were violated. He went out into international waters. We had a warrant out for him, and we got him. So you're not helpless. Terrorists can be beaten. It's not easy, but really when terrorism gets serious, I think it's going to get suppressed. That's been its history. Italy The Red Brigades murdered the Prime Minister. The Red Brigades are gone by a combination of good police work, good intelligence work, the support of the population against these people. The Baader-Meinhof group in Germany, which had a lot of people terrorized, is gone by some very good work done against them. But they can be defeated. But it's a tough racket, and it's a dangerous one, and it requires a lot of people to work on it. Yes, sir.
My name is Steve Webster from Indiana University in Indiana. My question concerns what you just said. Granted that our electronic intelligence capability is very good, it's very effective, yet for all of our satellites, again, we have not been able to locate the hostages or do any sort of effective groundwork. And I was wondering if you could comment on the trade-off between human intelligence and electronic intelligence, and maybe we are emphasizing electronic intelligence too much, or conversely, maybe we're emphasizing human intelligence too little.
This is always a little tension between the two, naturally. The electronic stuff obviously costs an awful lot of money. Put satellites up there, I mean, you're talking about billions of dollars. I sometimes kid that it cost us billions of dollars to learn about the Soviet Union, what they get for a subscription to Aviation Week here. So be it, we have to spend it. The human intelligence is not a substitute. You use both. And to a degree, you can have them help each other. They can be used in tandem on a target. The human intelligence is expensive also. It's expensive in staffs, it's been expensive in training, in language training, cultural training, all the rest of it. It's very difficult in terms of adequate cover for our people. You don't go abroad with an initial CIA on your hatband. You have to have some other ostensible reason for being there. And the United States, we are the only country that I ever heard of that now says, oh, you can't use journalists, you can't use missionaries, you can't use Fulbrights, you can't use the Peace Corps, you can't use this, you can't use that. You look at the normal community overseas, who else is there? So it's a tough racket, and I think it requires, as much as anything, a toughness of spirit by us, that we're willing to go into these things seriously and for a long term and hard at it. And don't cut the budget just because everything's quiet in that area one day. Keep it up. Keep people learning Farsi. When the Shah was in, did we have enough people studying Farsi? No. It's a very expensive proposition. You have to have them both. You can't do without one, you can't do without the other. And it's just a matter of, in some areas you can get a lot more with the open approach and even with the agent. In some areas you need a very heavy technological effort in order to get access to it. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Laura Schneider from Ramapo College of New Jersey. I'd like to know if you could talk about possible career options in the CIA.
Mm-hmm. Sure. There are essentially 4 careers in CIA. The one is the scientist, technology, electric engineers, people like this, who work on some of these fancy new systems and the more delicate machinery, photo operations, photo interpretation, all that kind of thing. There are lots of those kind of technical skills that are needed. And there's a whole career path in the technical area. The second is the analyst, the student. And the student is largely going to be here in the Washington area. He's going to receive all the information about, say, India, and he's going to study it. And he's going to get to know it very well and know a lot about India, and then write reports about what's happening there and what's going to happen there, who's going to win the election, that sort of thing. And that's a career path. Now, obviously, the scientist area, you have to have those scientific qualities to get in. The analyst, normally they require an advanced degree in one of the liberal arts, more or less, the history, political science, economics, things of that nature, of course. And they go in as a career in there. The third is the operations officer who lives overseas or spends a good portion. he or she, and there are she's, a lot of them. As a matter of fact, we've had she chiefs of station, so I nominated the first one. That path the person goes into, you get a little training in the tradecraft, how to make secret meetings and all that sort of thing. You go and live in a country, speak the language, get to know the people, collect intelligence, develop friends and associates and agents and all the rest of it, and try to maintain secret communication with them and do whatever needs to be done. And there's a premium on language capability, obviously. There also is a premium there on somebody having done something other than just been a student. Not necessarily an advanced degree, but military experience, business experience abroad, some obvious interest in foreign parts, foreign cultures, things like that nature, and having done some work in that kind of an area, that gives them a leg up on it. And the fourth category is the normal government administrative function, personnel, logistics, finance, all that sort of thing. That, of course, you get a little different than the normal department here. When you talk about logistics, you're dealing with some fairly funny equipment sometimes, not just talking about trucks and cars and things. So those are essentially the four career paths. They have recruiting stations around the country. They're in the phone book in many cities as a recruiting station. The best way to do it is to contact one of those people. Some of your schools, I'm sure the recruiters are around to your schools and leaving their identity and cards so that anybody who's interested can find out. And they'll give you a little general information about the agency, and they'll probably interview you, just a preliminary interview, to see whether you seem to have enough of what they need to be interested. Then if you do go into it, you have to face this enormously long personal history thing that you have to fill out, showing every place you lived and all the rest of it. And that will be cross-checked in investigation. You will have to go through a psychological test to see that you're stable and solid. You will go through a polygraph, which I have done twice. It's a miserable experience, but it's very worthwhile for the sensitive roles. I'm not a believer in it as a way to convict people of crimes. I'm not a believer in it for mass use for everybody, but I am a believer in it for use for sensitive jobs in our government, such as the intelligence. And so you go through that, and if you make them all, then you'll go to the training and start a career. And it's, you know, I think, frankly, that the next 25 years should be, if anything, much more exciting than the past, because of the new ways of learning, the new ways of handling information, the new kind of information coming available to us, the new technology, and how it's going to change. We're at the verge of the so-called information age, and it's going to be an absolutely fascinating period. Yes, yes, ma'am.
Joanne O'Connor from Indiana University. Do you believe that CIA or organizing assassinations, coup attempts, things like that exceed U.S. muscle? You know, should they be into that kind of stuff?
Well, I do not believe in assassination, and I'm the guy who wrote the first directive that says we will not do it. That was a major subject of the investigations in the mid-70s, and substantially responsible for having started the investigations, because the story got out. The committee went into it in great detail, and one of its findings, I think, is fairly instructive. They said CIA never assassinated any foreign leader, or, you know, political, never assassinated any. It had some contacts with people who assassinated. The generals in Vietnam killed President Diem. I think it was the dumbest thing that was ever done. The Americans were in touch with the generals, but nobody had really contemplated that they would kill President Diem. There are a couple of those kinds of incidents. There was one fellow who had the bright idea of eliminating Patrice Lumumba with some poison. They sent the poison over to one of our stations in Africa, I've forgotten which one. The local fellow there said, absolutely not. I'm going to have nothing to do with it. And it stopped. And he died for other reasons, but CIA did not have anything to do with it. But there are enough of those little murky ones around that made great copy for a year. And the rule is now in a presidential directive. We shall not. Now, there are some second thoughts always about that when you're dealing with people like some of these terrorist leaders. But I think if they get killed in the midst of a kidnap attempt, well, that's fair game. That's all right. But a deliberate attempted assassination, I think we get more trouble than benefit out of it. And I don't think our people are really up to it. Now, that excludes time of war. If we're at war, then I don't believe that when the young people of each country are killing each other, the old people should be immune. And I would very cheerfully have helped carry the bomb into Hitler's bunker in 1944. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Vincent Matthews, Texas Christian University. During the last election, a lot of information was distributed to the effect that during President Bush's tenure with the CIA, he was largely out of the loop of information and served little more than a cheerleader to pep up Congress's spirits with the CIA. I would like some comments from you on the accuracy of this statement, and also discerning with his relation to the CIA, how does that, what his tenure there, how does that affect the way he acts with the CIA today?
Well, I didn't hear that about him. I know that he was very popular in CIA. They held him in great respect. I don't think he was out of the loop at all. He was very much, very actively running the agency, traveled a certain amount to see its activities in various places, and certainly presided over it. I mean, that doesn't mean he did every little detail in the agency, neither did I, and you shouldn't. But no, I think he was a very successful chief of CIA. He was only there a year, so it really wasn't very long. You don't get all that much done in a year, as you well know. In terms of how has his experience affected his present activities and relationship, and you shouldn't. But no, I think he was a very successful chief of CIA. He was only there a year, so it really wasn't very long. You don't get all that much done in a year, as you well know. In terms of how has his experience affected his present activities and relationship, I think he understands the agency. I think he understands the value of it, and I think he wants to run it. He wants to make sure it's under control. He doesn't want it to get out of control. Now, President Reagan, of course, let things go on, and I don't think President Bush is going to let things go on. I think he's going to be much tighter. But, for instance, he did initiate a system by which every morning a CIA officer comes out and gives him the intelligence briefing. The National Security Advisor is there, but the intelligence comes direct from intelligence, not through the National Security Advisor, as other presidents have done. So I think he's aware of its capabilities. He's aware of its weaknesses. He said, we're not dealing with a full deck of information on the hostage crisis. That's true. I'm sure he's got pressure on them to do better. But no, I think he was very well regarded for the way he handled himself there. Yes, ma'am.
Tracy Rich from the University of Oklahoma. I was wondering, with all the other countries becoming so advanced and catching up to the United States in technology, is the United States being stingy in communicating with other countries? And say, is Japan being stingy in giving us information also between different communications and technologies and new technological innovations?
Any country has certain limitations on how generous they are with some very sensitive material. The Japanese really don't have very many secrets. They learned their lesson rather harshly. Their skill comes from just hard work and application, and they don't, if anything, they benefit from the exchange of information. As they take a research development item and they turn it into a commercial product. While we have problems making that transition sometimes, and they busily do it. The Japanese have 25,000 people in the New York area. What are they doing? They're looking into American habits, the household habits, and then they design products for them. So the products sell very well. reliability, fit with other things, all that sort of thing. How is that intelligence? Yeah, that's intelligence work to try to understand what the market is. You know, we don't have very many people in Tokyo who speak Japanese who are studying the Japanese market. Otherwise, we discover that you can't sell big refrigerators in Japan because they fill up the whole house. I mean, it won't work. You've got to get small refrigerators if you're going to sell them in Japan, things of that nature. You can't sell them American cars. Why? Because we put the driver's seat on the left. And in Japan, you drive on the left of the road, so you have to have the driver's seat on the other side. You're not going to sell left-hand drive cars in Japan. So it's that kind of market intelligence that certainly they concentrate on. In terms of restriction on the movement of sensitive data, we are the target of lots of attempts to penetrate our intelligence, our sensitive technological data. We have laws about exporting it, and we catch people every now and again cheating on the laws, and we put them in jail. All sorts of different technologies are under a restraint that they cannot be placed abroad. Now, sometimes we're inclined to exaggerate that. And there was a period in which we said, well, you can't export a calculator because it has a chip in it. Well, you can buy calculators all over the world. So instead of exporting American calculators, people were buying Japanese and French and German calculators. And that really wasn't doing us any good. Wasn't doing them any, wasn't limiting the spread of the technology to the other side. Government just released some laptop computers to go to the Soviet Union. Big deal. There are all sorts of high technology inside it. That's right. But if we don't release it, they'll get it anywhere, somewhere else. So you just can't hold back that information very long. Otherwise, you're going to limit your own capability of exporting. And that's the balance you have to argue through all the time. Yes, sir.
My name is Jeff Barlow from the School of the Ozarks in Missouri. I was wondering if you could discuss the CIA's exploration of the communist infiltration into the American political society.
Well, it's the way you say it, it's not CIA's job. That's to the extent that it is anybody's job, it's the FBI's job in the United States. And they have to find a violation of law before they can investigate, really. They have to find some potential violation of law. They got in a little trouble here recently. They started off an investigation and then sort of mindlessly continued it, and there wasn't any violation of law at all, and there's been some criticism of it. The CIA is responsible for that kind of information abroad. And if we could get into the headquarters of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, I assure you we'd be there. And we would be reporting whatever plans, whatever support they are giving toward developing a communist base in this country, or influencing American opinion, not just a communist apparatus. We certainly would try to find out what agents they're sending here. We do catch them every now and again. The FBI has that as a major job here in this country. It's a huge job because the number of foreigners in this country, almost impossible to conceive of following all the foreigners around in this country, because you have something bigger than the Army, Navy, and Marines and Air Force all in one piece. And we don't want to live that way anyway. Americans don't want to live that way. So are we a bit exposed? Yeah. Does the other side get very much out of this? I think they get some marginal technical information. That's what they do get. They used to get what I called ideological spies, people who spied for the Soviet Union because they believed in the revolution, in the Soviet position against Hitler and fascism. And those were the famous spies of the late 1930s. They were ideologues. They wanted to help the Soviet Union. Nobody believes in the Soviet Union now. Even in the Soviet Union, they don't believe in it. So today, what kind of people are they getting? They're getting tawdry little people who will sell their country for a few tens of thousands of dollars. And unfortunately, they do not badly at that. In part, it's sort of the breakdown of discipline and standards that occurred in our country during the 70s after Vietnam and Watergate and all that sort of thing. The me generation, that sort of thing. Commander Walker, the naval officer who spied for the Soviet Union, tried to get his daughter to help. His argument to his daughter, oh, everybody does it. I mean, that's a hell of a thing for a serving naval officer to say. You know, it's astounding. You can't even think of it. So we are vulnerable to these punks that sell their country for that kind of thing. On the other hand, I would like to bring it into balance a little bit. In the 40-odd years of its history, CIA has had one defector go to the Soviet Union. That's this fellow Howard, who went a couple of years ago. And he was mad because he'd been fired by CIA and not allowed to stay there. And he is living in the Soviet Union today. He got in touch with them and he told them a lot of information that has hurt us. They executed an agent of the Americans in the Soviet Union as a result of his information. But that's one. How many KGB officers have defected to the free world? Hundreds. So let's get this in a little perspective. Yes, we do take losses, but the strength of this society in its freedom is so much stronger than anything else that we can stand even those few slobs at the edge. Yes, sir.
My name is Clint Garrett from Indiana University, and I'm very concerned, especially in the intelligence sector, of almost the handicapness of the American administration and its staff when dealing with a foreign culture to actually understand that culture and what it's about before dealing with it. Examples with the Middle East through the history of the United States are perfect examples, and our examples post-FDR with South America are other examples. But with the battle of terrorism now, I don't mean any offense by this, but terms such as fanatic are perfect examples of really looking at what these people are about, and whether people who, when they're speaking, think that the American public, who is misinformed many times in foreign policy, tends to look at that and go with that idea. And until the American administration really starts to understand these cultures, I don't even think we'll begin a battle or containment of terrorism.
Couldn't agree more. I fully agree with your point. It starts with language study. We're abysmal in language study in this country. You can graduate from colleges without a foreign language, believe it or not. I mean, much less high school. You know, we ought to have requirements for language study in high school at least. Other nations learn 2 and 3 languages just sort of normally. We struggle with English sometimes. We do have a lot of foreign travel, and that's helpful. We've got a certain amount of foreign business. And they get a degree of familiarity. And we have a lot of people in this country who come from somewhere else. And that's our strongest position. Almost everybody came from somewhere else. And they have a sort of an interest in the old country, so that you can turn to them for some help and various things. So we have strengths, but I could not agree more on the essential of understanding the culture. President Reagan said one of the most useful things, I thought. It's a sort of a funny statement, but he went down to Latin America one time and he stopped in 3 countries. And he came back, and on his way back he said, you know, they're all different down there. Well, that's a brilliant step ahead. You know, they all don't wear sombreros and sit in the sun. We've moved ahead. We understand they're all different down there. That's a big step ahead in our comprehension of the realities of the world. When the president says it, you know, it has an impact. It's a sort of funny thing, but it's true. Yes, sir.
My name is Adam DeRosa from Indiana University. My question is that I agree with your sentiments that Soviet is going down in the spies lately, but isn't the CIA a little bit alarmed by the recent revelations of the bugging in the Moscow embassy and the selling of secrets by Marines and the Felix Bloch problem?
Oh, sure. I mean, you're concerned about that. I think the Moscow embassy situation, most people that have lived behind the curtain in the last 20, 30 years have just assumed everything was bugged. Sort of what else is new was the reaction. Now, this one was a rather more sophisticated operation, I gather, than the ones that had been going on before. But they've been bugging our embassies for years in that part of the world. There's no question about it. Very enthusiastically, you know, and we we find the bugs and get mad about it, and it goes away, and they put another one in after a while. The Moscow embassy was an extreme case. They had the whole place wired for sound, and then we have the dilemma of what are we going to do about it, and we're fooling around with that, and we got a lot of money in it. What do you do with it? Some people say, you know, sell the building to Pepsi-Cola or something, let them use it. But as for, I am concerned about this breakdown in discipline and standards, because I think it affects a lot of things aside from just the intelligence area. It affects all sorts of things. And that came out of this miserable history of the Vietnam War. And this November you can read my views about it. Yes, sir.
Jeff Harold, James Madison University. I was wondering, the KGB has a large amount of embassy officials in Mexico City. I mean, KGB officials that pose as embassy officials. Do we have a comparable facility in the East Bloc? And also, I was wondering, to what extent does the CIA rivalry with the DIA affect productivity?
Well, I really am not going to answer your first question. Let's just say we're going to try to get intelligence wherever we can get it. It's a complicated problem as to sort of where we are and where we aren't. The second one, no, the DIA, CIA, that, you know, there's a little natural jurisdictional rivalry from time to time, but they're tied together at the top in a weekly meeting that the director of CIA chairs and the director of DIA comes to, and the directors of the Army, Navy, and Air Force intelligence come to, and that meets almost every week, and they hammer out differences in that fashion. It's not a serious problem. You know, once in a while you get the bureaucratic games, but and the FBI fellow comes to that too. So it works pretty well. Nothing, you know, it works at least as well as the Agriculture Department and some other department, maybe better. Yes, sir.
Steve Thompson from Indiana University of Pennsylvania. I'm given to understand that only about 5 or 10% of the CIA's overall energies are spent on covert action. A colleague of yours, Ted Shackley, had wrote a book entitled The Third Option, talking about paramilitary and proxy warfare as a valuable foreign policy tool. Do you feel that the CIA is truly equipped to handle out those types of, to handle and carry out those types of options when it's really designed to gather intelligence and not be a tool for implementing foreign policy?
This is always a debate as to whether you really should have the action responsibility in the same shop that the analysts are supposed to be in. In actual fact, you separate them out inside the building. But very early in the game, it was discovered that if you're going to collect intelligence and if you're going to do influence, you're going to end up turning to more or less the same kind of people in foreign countries. And there was a period at which the action was a separate organization from the intelligence collection. And they spent a lot of time chasing each other around instead of doing useful work together. They put it together in the early 50s, sort of forced them to work together, and it's worked reasonably well since then. The percentage you refer to is a variable one. During certain periods in which the government wants to be very activist, that percentage will go up. When the government wants to be more passive, the percentage will go down. I looked at it one time and I found that in the 50s almost 50% went for action. By the early 70s it was down to about 5%, and I gather it stayed there for part of the 70s. I would guess that it's gone up during the Reagan years. They have had some fairly successful operations, I think. The Angola thing has turned out to be successful. They are achieving the objective we long had of getting a coalition, federation of some sort, so that the two forces can work together. The Afghanistan, I say, is a very, very successful operation. And the Cambodian thing seems to be coming out all right. And I don't know the details. I haven't read any secrets for the last X number of years, except the ones I read in the papers. But I gather we have been giving support there. and it's working out. They're now trying to negotiate a solution in Cambodia. So it can be used for that purpose, and it will be used depending on the government's policy. If the government wants to do it, then CIA is your tool. What you don't do is do what Colonel North did, try to rinky-dink his own system up, because then you end up dealing with some ragtag Middle East arms merchant who takes you and doesn't do anything. CIA knows how to run these things and know how to check the people out before you have any confidence in them. Yes, sir.
Casey O'Connell, Metropolitan State College, Denver. How can the CIA justify its actions when they're in direct contradiction to what America stands for? For example, supporting dictatorships when we're supposed to stand for democracy.
Well, that's a frequent charge. The CIA is going to do what its government tells it to. When its government was faced with communist subversion in Western Europe, the CIA's solution was to support the center democratic forces in Western Europe in the 50s, and I was involved in that in Rome. Not the right wing, not the fascists or monarchists or any of that stuff, but the Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, things of that nature. And we did, and we succeeded, because those were the targets of the Soviet Union, and we wanted to strengthen them to resist. In some countries, the CIA has supported a particular dictator. There's no question about it. Depends on the country, depends on what the facts of life, whether there's a real alternative. Depends on whether there was a threat to that country from another country. President No Dinh Diem was called a dictator. I don't think he was, but he's certainly authoritarian. There's no question about that. He was a Mandarin. Did we support him? Yes. He was the best thing around for a long time, because the alternative was the communist. And I mean literally in the 50s. In the 60s, we withdrew our support from him and helped overthrow him, which I thought was a dumb action. But nonetheless, the government decided on it. The president decided on it. So the CIA will do what its government wants. And in terms of, say, Latin America, when Che Guevara was threatening to turn the place into a continent hostile to the United States, we aided various groups who were trying to knock him down and reduce that threat. To us, the threat was not a military-run Latin America. That was no particular threat to us, but a communist-oriented Latin America would have been a threat to us. And that's the thinking. I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying we do not have for these kinds of actions, there are two moral justifications. They're the same as the justification of the just war in old church doctrine and philosophy. There are two requirements. It be in your self-defense, and second, that the action be proportionate. Those are the two major requirements. There are a lot of other details, but those are the two major requirements. Now, if it's in your defense, you can help a friend, you can do it yourself, whatever. But you don't have a right to be a missionary, to change people. That's offensive. That's aggressive. Then your action has to be proportionate. You don't drop a nuclear weapon where you could help some guy become a political leader. It's a much less proportionate interference than military action, for instance. And I think this is what you have to look for. Is it truly a matter of self-defense, or are you, with pride, trying to force your ideas onto another country? Secondly, is your action proportionate to the problem, or are you excessive? And you can follow that through most. I won't say we're right in all the cases you apply those rules. Just ask the Mexicans. I mean, we stole half their country, and they're afraid we're going to steal the other half. So you're not going to justify every action, every war that America has been in as a just war, and you're not going to justify everyone as proportionate or in self-defense. And similarly, in the intelligence actions, you're not going to be able to justify everyone. But I think that's a good rule of thumb to use when you're judging them. And incidentally, the requirement that you explain it to the congressional committees is a way of getting that kind of judgment imposed on whether to go ahead with the program. Because it isn't just the President's offhand thought. It goes through the American government and its procedures. And if the committee accepts it,